Define preface to the lyrical ballads 1802. Preface to the lyrical ballads. Wordsworth begins his preface to the lyrical ballads of 1802 edition by referring to the 1798 edition of his poems. He shows that the first edition of the lyrical ballads was published as an experiment of emotional and excitement, a state that can give pleasure which the readers expect from poetry. He hopes that his poems would either give uncommon pleasure or uncommon dislike to the reader. It was a new kind of poetry that he had experimented with the reactions of the readers. As Wordsworth states that if there is worth in verses, appreciation would come by itself without any argumentation on his part. Incidents from common life. Wordsworth has written the poems with a definite purpose in mind. His purpose has been to choose incidents and situations from common people, and his selection of language is really common used by men. He has chosen the various aspects of humble and rustic life because the elementary feelings of the human heart exist in the simplicity of life. The manners of the rustic life are not sophisticated and can be understood by more easily in rustic condition. Human passions are deeply associated with the external nature, so they are more noble than the emotion of city folk. The essential passions of human heart find frank expression in humble and rustic surroundings. Purpose of his poetry. Wordsworth next points out that his poems differ from the popular poetry of the day. Each of the poems has been written with a worthy purpose in the lyrical ballads that enlightens the readers and purifying their affections. His thoughts always connects one thought with another. As he defines poetry, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and a poet is man endowed with nature and simple use of language. Inclination of sentiments. In his poems, sentiments are more important than accent and situation. His aims in these poems was to show the human heart's desire without the use of violent sensationalism. He thinks that in big cities where a large number of people live their lives in crowd and the sameness of their occupations make their lives monotonous. So he craves excitement through sensationalism. This craving is satisfied by newspapers, theaters, and other forms of cheap literature. Avoid of poetic diction. His purpose was to use the common language and has avoided poetic diction so that he can come close to the language of common people. In the other words, he has been true to nature and has used a natural style. His turn of poetry was very simple, that can be understood by everyone in the society. Wordsworth's romantic conception. He now gives us his romantic conception and functions. He is a person who writes not for his own pleasure, but his thoughts and emotion to his readers. He has a great knowledge of human nature and the passion which he experienced. He has more comprehensive soul and can share the emotional experiences, feelings, and emotions of others. And lastly, he is a man who has greater power of expression and communication. The poet, no doubt, has a power of communication. Poet is a translator of emotion. Critics point out that a poet is a translator, so he translates his emotions and feelings through poetry and conveys us everything which observes and contemplates on that particular action. According to Aristotle, poetic truth is much higher than the truth of his history and philosophy, because history deals merely with facts and philosophy deals with abstract truths, while poetry alone deals both with the particular and the general. Now, four stages of creation. Further, Wordsworth begins to portray the process of poetic creation. His famous definition of poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. There are four stages of process of creation. First is observation, second recollection of ideas, third contemplation of his thoughts, and fourth imaginative excitement. Wordsworth warns not to lose self-confidence against the false criticism. The real things in poetry is feeling and not the language. The reader is requested to judge his poems by his own feelings, not by the literary critics. A poet has talent to feel the same feeling to the readers. Ambition of poetry. Poetry aims at a universal truth. As it is said, poetry is the image of man and nature. This is the only obstacle between poet and the truth. Poetic diction comes in the way of truth, and so it must not be restored by the poet. The function of poetry gives immediate pleasure, sympathy, feeling. Even knowledge and the painful is a source of pleasure. Each reality and cosmic truth which we feel is the ambition of poetry. Conclusion. Thus, poetry is the first and the last of all knowledge. It is as immortal as the soul of man. Poetry is something sublime, noble, and excellence of thoughts. Poet speaks through the character's mouth of the society. The poet does not write for self gratification, but for the society. His thoughts, feelings, and the language used by common men. As it is said, poets do not write for poets alone, but for men. Thank you.